Hello, my name is Jonathan Ng, and I'm with my colleague Zach Kahn of the Center for Presidential History. It is October 19th, 2023. Today we have the honor of speaking with Dr. Melvyn Leffler, a distinguished historian of U.S. foreign relations. Over his career, he has published numerous books such as A Preponderance of Power, Safeguarding Democratic Capitalism, and his most recent title, Confronting Saddam Hussein. Today we are delighted to have the opportunity to speak with him about the life and the legacy of Walter LaFeber. To kick things off, Dr. Leffler, I was wondering if you could talk about how you first met LaFeber and some of your initial interactions.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Jonathan. Thanks for interviewing me. I'm not sure I can tell you when I first met Walt LaFeber. I was a student at Cornell University in the mid to late 1960s, but I did not take any of his courses as a student. I believe since I was involved in anti-war, anti-Vietnam War demonstrations and very engaged with that issue, even as an undergraduate, I think I recall going to some teach-ins in which Walt LaFeber participated, often debating, if I recall, Myron Rush, government professor. I think that's who he debated at the time. I don't exactly recall. I think I heard Walt LaFeber talk on the on the steps of Willard Straight Hall, which is the big student union building at Cornell, a few times. I wouldn't swear to that, but I think so. Subsequently, while I was a graduate student, my younger brother did take his course and loved his course and often talked to me about it. I was then in graduate school and reading a lot of Walter LaFeber's books as a graduate student. I don't know really when I first began interacting with Walt LaFeber as a young professor. He, of course, was 10 or 12 years older than I was, and he was a giant in the field. I was just sort of an innocent new assistant professor. I know I met him at various meetings, but I couldn't tell you when was the first time I met him.
Well, thank you for that. I was wondering about the conversations perhaps that you had with your brother about the teaching of LaFeber. One thing that a lot of his students said was that he exercised a certain magnetism. Even on Saturday mornings when he lectured, his classroom was often at capacity. I was wondering if during your time at Cornell in discussions with your brother or with other people on campus, if you got a sense of what exactly was the attraction of
everyone loved his courses, and I shouldn't say everyone, but he was a hugely popular lecturer. My brother's wife was also a student at Cornell, and she loves to tell the story along the lines that you just said, that she would go with my brother on Saturday mornings to hear Walt LaFeber lecture. She had no interest really in the subject, and she still doesn't have much interest in the subject of American foreign policy. But she remembers just going to listen to him lecture. I think that he was captivating because he lectured without notes for the most part, as I understand it. I never saw him at that time lecture, but I think almost everyone said he lectured without notes. He had clear themes to convey to the students, and I think many students saw the salience of what he was saying historically to the contemporary era in which they were grappling with many, many difficult foreign policy issues, and most conspicuously, the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, did you say that was your brother's wife? Or?
My brother's wife.
Yeah,
they weren't married at the time. She was just a student at Cornell.
Well, that's a very wonderful memory that she has. You referenced reading a lot of his works when you were a graduate student. Could you talk about the effect that those works had on you as a young historian and how they've informed your own scholarship?
Yes, tremendously. I mean, I started off my career tremendously influenced by William A. Williams and Walter LaFeber. Walter LaFeber's book, The New Empire, was one of the first books that I read as a graduate student. I remember I chose to write a seminar paper, probably my first year in graduate school, on why McKinley went to war in 1898. And as background, as one of the critical books, I read Walter LaFeber's The New Empire. I was tremendously influenced by it, as I already had been by William A. Williams's Tragedy of American Diplomacy, especially the first 2 or 3 chapters of the Tragedy of American Diplomacy. What was so influential and impactful was the skillful way Walt LaFeber integrated intellectual history and ideas with economic, with an analysis of the economic roots of foreign policy and the largest strategic geopolitical thinking of Americans at the time. I love the way he began The New Empire, as I recall it. I haven't looked at it for many years now, but as I recall it, talking about, key intellectual leaders, talking about strategists, talking about the economic foundations of late 19th century American foreign policy. I thought he deftly wove together intellectual and economic motivations. Later on, I think I began to think that he often conflated these things, but at the time, I thought that it was a beautifully done, skillful analysis of the basic motivations. And I think he was extremely good at bringing in key policymakers. And one of the real attributes of his work, I think, was that he often could talk about deeper intellectual and economic and strategic trends, but link those trends to real people in a very vivid, captivating way. I also was tremendously influenced when I read The New Empire by the sources that he used, and those sources had a tremendous impact on my own subsequent research and on my dissertation. I learned for the first time about trade associations and business groups that I had no idea existed, and I learned how sort of really open sources, these are the proceedings of the National Association of Manufacturers, of the National Foreign Trade Council. These were, invaluable sources invaluable for him in developing his own interpretation, but also became invaluable for me in terms of the way I went about writing my dissertation and my first book.
Excellent. One thing that caught my ear is you were talking about how you managed to deftly balance intellectual history with an interest in economic factors as well. Sometimes, I think most of the time, historians think of LaFeber as a Wisconsin school historian, as a Cold War revisionist, and there's different titles or categories that are used to explain his work and his contribution to the field. I was wondering, how useful do you think these terms are? Do you have your own way that you conceptualize how he fits into the history of U.S. foreign policy, the historiography at large?
Well, I think the historiography was appropriate at the time, and for many, meaning the 1960s, and for many, many subsequent decades. I think that there was a very influential, powerful, compelling Wisconsin school of interpretation. William A. Williams was really the mentor, or not really the only mentor, but he was sort of the father of the school, you might say. And then there were, the key students that all of us read in the 1960s and the 1970s. The key students being Walt LaFeber, Lloyd Gardner, Tom McCormick, and then there were, a dozen others whose names, Schoonover, I think, I don't remember all their names right now. But, and I think that they were revisionist in the sense that they were arguing the importance of domestic factors, especially economic factors, in the shaping of American foreign policy. They were sort of a counterpoint to realism, whatever realism might constitute. I think there's more ambiguity about what constituted realism than what constituted revisionism. But the idea behind a lot of their works that was so resonant for young scholars like myself was the agency that they assigned to the makers of American foreign policy. The United States and its leaders had a lot of agency. They had goals that they actively pursued. They had a vision of empire, and what Walt LaFeber called, the new empire, a commercial empire, but that this was a coherent strategy of policymakers and businessmen. And so I think that casting these people as revisionists was an appropriate category, and they had tremendous impact on the writing of American foreign policy, all for the good, I would say. I know they were castigated, and I myself came to sort of be somewhat of a skeptic of some of the arguments that they were making, but they stimulated an enormous amount of constructive scholarship, and they also, even more importantly, in terms of the evolution of domestic politics, they made a lot of young people think really hard and critically about America's role in the world and America's responsibility for all sorts of developments. And of course, one of the important themes that they developed, not right then in the 60s, but a little later, late 60s, 70s, was America's own responsibility for the onset of the Cold War. In that sense, they were very revisionist in terms of revising the notion that the United States was simply reacting to Stalin's aggression or the adventurism of the Soviet Union. What they demonstrated was that the United States was in part responsible for the Cold War. Some of them said largely responsible for the onset of the Cold War, and it made all of us think very critically and analytically about, well, what really were the factors that led to the Cold War? And in that sense, they were extremely revisionist. Of course, Walt LaFeber's famous book on the Cold War, the origins of the Cold War, which went through the United States and Russia in the Cold War. I forget the exact name, but that book must have gone through 10, 12, 14 editions The first editions was when I was a really young guy, and his interpretation of the Cold War was extremely important in shaping the historiography of a generation, as was Lloyd Gardner's, as was Tom McCormick's, all these people. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you were saying about the importance that they assigned to the agency of U.S. policymakers. I think that a lot of the critics of scholars like LaFeber would say that they were economic determinists, that they had overly mechanical view of how foreign policy worked. But I agree with you that they did assign a lot of margin for action and agency to U.S. foreign policymakers in a way that was stimulating and important to the discipline.
I think there was always an ambiguity in the writing, both of Williams and Walt LaFeber in particular, and contrast, and Lloyd Gardner too, about whether it's really the underlying economic factors that are shaping policy, or whether it's the perceptions and ideas about those economic factors that are shaping policy. And I think that was an ambiguity in some of the writings, a constructive ambiguity. Was the Marxists would say the American economy capitalist economy was dependent on markets abroad, et cetera, et cetera. In the writings of William A. Williams and Walt LaFeber and Lloyd Gardner, it was sometimes unclear whether it was the economic structures that dictated this or whether it was the perceptions of the policymakers themselves about the economic structures, and that they actually could have, if they wished, by they I mean the leaders and the businessmen, but mostly I'm talking now about the policymakers, might have been able to reshape the direction of American policy, and allowed much more domestic initiatives to deal with the liabilities and shortcomings of a dynamic capitalist economy. That often it seemed to me that what William A. Williams was saying was that businessmen and political leaders defined the answers to America's economic problems by seeking markets abroad. That's simply stated. But that they had the opportunity to undertake domestic initiatives that might provide answers to the problems generated by a capitalist economy. It didn't inevitably have to lead to that. And in fact, I think that that's what William A. Williams and some of the revisionists were often preaching, that rather than simply championing markets abroad and investment outlets, that it was entirely possible to reshape America by looking to the government for more regulation, for a more equitable distribution of income, so that domestic constituents could buy what seemed like the surplus, and that the surplus didn't have to go abroad, but it could be dealt with at home. And so I think that the Wisconsin school was creating an ambiguity there, not purposefully. It was inherent in their work about whether it was inevitable that the United States get involved in informal empire and sometimes overseas military adventures, or whether all of this could be avoided through smarter policy. And so it made a big difference, I think, about whether you think of this in structural economic terms or whether they are ideas about the economy.
I think that's a very good distinction. It reminds me of the classic text, of course, the tragedy of American diplomacy. And tragedy can be interpreted in different ways. In some traditions, a tragic outcome is something that's inevitable, and other traditions, it's something that does not need to occur.
Yeah, I think Williams was telling us it didn't need to occur. That's my reading of it. That was the tragedy. The tragedy was that there were really alternatives that were not pursued. Sometimes, however, some of the Wisconsin people were suggesting that it was inevitable. If it's inevitable, then I don't think it's a tragedy. The tragedy is when you have options that are constructive that you don't take, that you forsake, and then you wind up in a much more difficult predicament, as the United States did. What the Wisconsin school was telling us, I mean, what Walt LaFeber was telling us in inevitable revolutions. I mean, you're going to, if you think this way, you're going to get caught up inevitably in crushing revolutionary nationalist movements. You don't have to. I think he's saying, Americans, you don't have to do this. But try to think more constructively.
I also agree with your characterization of LaFeber's mindset, because in a work like Inevitable Revolutions, I mean, it's a rigorous scholarly work, but it's clearly directed toward U.S. society, and in particular to the Reagan administration, but which by that point, 1983, was mired in El Salvador and supporting a Contra war in Nicaragua and so on.
Yeah, I think Walt LaFeber and Lloyd Gardner and Tom McCormick and William A. Williams were so important and so influential and had such an impact on me was because they were saying history matters. Understand history, because if you understand history, you can understand some of the options that we are facing today, whether it be the 70s or the 80s or then the 90s. You can understand those options better, and you could help make better choices. And I think the very fact that these historians were writing with that purpose in mind was tremendously energizing to my generation. It was very energizing to me. I didn't really know Walt LaFeber very well personally, but although I had some interactions with him as a young and middle-aged professor, but his books tremendously engaged me because they were not only interesting historically, they were telling me about the contemporary issues I was very much involved in.
To close, I was wondering if you would like to talk about any of those interactions that you had with LaFeber, or perhaps in addition to that, what ultimately you take away as his legacy for you personally or for the historical discipline more broadly?
Well, I think his scholarship, at least for me, was incredibly important and significant. But there was also something about the person of Walt LaFeber that was very impactful, even though I never knew him in any intimate way. Walt LaFeber always was the perfect gentleman as I engaged him. He had opinions, strong opinions, but he was able to express them in modulated tones that rarely offended. I would not say never offended, but rarely offended. He did not really like to engage, as far as I could tell, in gossip. about other people except maybe with his most intimate friends like Lloyd Gardner and maybe some of his students like Frank Castigliolo, who were, so close to him. But as a person who did develop a real rapport with him as I grew older, which I would say that I did, he was always remained just incredibly tactful, respectful, gentlemanly. He could present his views, I thought, very deftly without arousing animosity. In contrast to myself, when I often presented views, I could easily arouse animosity. But Walt just had a skill. It was part of his persona. And I think the result of that was that he was widely beloved and respected. That's my perception.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Leffler, for participating in this interview.
I'm glad to do so. Thanks for chatting with me.